In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where every lawn looked like it belonged in a glossy magazine, one small detail disturbed the perfect symmetry: a single, ordinary lawn chair. It wasn't expensive, it wasn't stylish, and it wasn't even new. But it belonged to a homeowner named Daniel, who enjoyed sitting outside in the evenings, sipping iced tea, and watching the sun dip below the rooftops. For him, the chair was not just a chair, it was a piece of comfort, a way to enjoy the home he worked so hard for. But for one neighbor, the chair was something else entirely. She was known by most in the community for her constant surveillance, her relentless complaints, and her fiery temper whenever things did not align with her personal standards. She was the neighborhood's self-proclaimed enforcer, though she had no real authority other than her loud voice and willingness to stir conflict. Her name was Karen. Karen had a reputation that extended beyond her block. Parents warned their children not to play too loudly near her yard. Delivery drivers sighed when they saw her address pop up on their route. And for Daniel, who had only recently moved into the neighborhood, he would soon learn that Karen had decided to set her eyes on him. The trouble began on a summer evening when Daniel placed his simple folding chair at the edge of his driveway. It wasn't blocking anything, it wasn't breaking any rule, and it certainly wasn't hurting anyone. He sat there quietly, scrolling on his phone, enjoying the fresh air. Yet across the street, Karen spotted the chair and felt a surge of irritation. To her, that chair was not just an object. It was disorder. It was rebellion. It was a disruption of the flawless image she demanded of her neighborhood. At first, Karen muttered complaints under her breath, pacing inside her house and glaring through her blinds. She snapped photos with her phone, zooming in on the chair like she was gathering evidence for a crime. And before long, she did what she always did when she felt her control slipping: she called the authorities. The 911 call was bizarre in its pettiness. Karen reported that there was an unauthorized object obstructing the neighborhood's appearance. She spoke with dramatic urgency, painting a picture of a dangerous obstruction in public view. When the dispatcher pressed for clarity, she exaggerated further, hinting that the chair might even be a hazard or part of suspicious activity. To Karen, this was all perfectly justified. To the dispatcher, it was just another call from a homeowner who had likely dialed before. But still, protocol required a response. And so, not long after, flashing lights crept down the quiet street, breaking the calm of the evening. Neighbors peeked out their windows, curious to see who the target of this visit would be. Some already had their guesses, because when Karen was involved, drama was never far away. When the officers arrived, they were puzzled. They saw Daniel sitting calmly in his chair, not disturbing anyone, not committing any crime. They saw a simple piece of furniture in a driveway, perfectly harmless. And then they saw Karen marching across her lawn, arms flailing, demanding action. For Daniel, confusion gave way to disbelief. He had lived in many places before, but never had he seen something as small as a lawn chair escalate into a police visit. He tried to keep his composure, but deep down he felt the sting of being targeted in his own home. The officers, clearly unamused, gave Karen a polite but firm explanation: nothing unlawful had occurred. The chair was fine. The man sitting in it was fine. And unless she could provide evidence of an actual violation, there was no reason for them to intervene further. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She argued. She demanded. She insisted that the neighborhood had standards that must be upheld, even though she herself wasn't a member of the HOA board and had no authority to speak on its behalf. Her protests grew louder, but the officers eventually cut the conversation short and left. The flashing lights faded, the patrol car drove away, and the neighborhood slowly settled back into silence. But the tension didn't leave. Not for Daniel, and not for Karen, because in Karen's eyes, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a battle. She had called the police and failed to get her way. To her, that meant she had lost control. And for someone like Karen, that was unacceptable. From that night forward, she became obsessed with the chair. Every evening, she would step outside to glare at it. She took new photos from different angles, as though compiling a legal case. She sent emails to the HOA board demanding they take action, copying multiple neighbors to stir outrage. And when those emails went unanswered or politely dismissed, she became angrier. Daniel, on the other hand, was determined not to let her ruin his peace. He kept sitting in his chair, calmly, refusing to acknowledge her antics. But deep inside, a seed of frustration was growing. Because while the chair itself was small, the principal was not. He had the right to enjoy his own property without harassment. He had the right to exist without being policed by a neighbor who seemed determined to control everyone around her. And so, while Karen plotted her next move, Daniel began considering his own. The turning point came 1 week later. Karen, in her relentless pursuit, escalated again. Late at night, under the cover of darkness, she crept across the street and attempted to drag the chair away. She thought no one would see. She thought she could finally erase the source of her irritation. But what she didn't realize was that Daniel had installed a security camera above his garage, and it captured everything. The next morning, Daniel reviewed the footage and felt a mix of anger and disbelief. His neighbor had crossed from harassment into trespassing. She wasn't just complaining anymore, she was acting. And if she thought this would intimidate him into compliance, she was about to learn that he had other tools at his disposal, because Daniel owned more than a security camera. He also owned a drone. It had started as a hobby, something to film landscapes and family gatherings. But now, Daniel realized it could become something else entirely. A way to document, to expose, to show the truth in a way no one could deny. And as Karen grew bolder, so too did Daniel's resolve. The stage was set. A petty feud over a lawn chair was about to escalate into a neighborhood spectacle. And with cameras rolling and a drone waiting to take flight, the story was about to take a turn that no one in the cul-de-sac could have predicted. The following week, the quiet suburb became a stage for a very unusual standoff. At first glance, everything looked normal. Lawns were freshly cut, mailboxes stood in neat rows, and cars glistened in driveways. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. Neighbors had begun whispering about the incident with the lawn chair. The flashing police lights, the raised voices, the sight of Karen storming across her lawn in the middle of the night, it all lingered in their minds like a rumor that refused to fade. Daniel, however, wasn't whispering. He was planning. For days, he replayed the security footage of Karen dragging his lawn chair across the street. Each time he watched it, his disbelief hardened into determination. This wasn't just about a piece of furniture anymore. It was about being harassed, trespassed against, and targeted without reason. If Karen wanted to play dirty, then Daniel would respond in a way she never saw coming. That's when he pulled his drone from storage. It had been sitting on a shelf for months, a high-tech piece of equipment gathering dust after a few casual flights. But now, in Daniel's hands, it became something else, a tool of accountability. With its wide-angle camera and ability to hover silently above rooftops, it could capture what no security camera could. It could follow Karen's behavior in real time, gathering proof that no one could dismiss. The first flight was cautious. Daniel launched the drone at dusk, guiding it above his backyard to test its stability. The hum of the propellers blended into the evening air. Neighbors who noticed barely glanced twice, assuming it was just a hobbyist enjoying the technology. But Daniel's focus wasn't on the sky, it was across the street. From his remote screen, he watched Karen pacing her driveway, muttering into her phone. She snapped photos of his yard again, zooming in on the chair like it was a crime scene. Daniel's drone captured everything, the lens recording every angle. And when Karen looked up, startled by the faint buzz above, the sight of the drone made her freeze. Her reaction was immediate. She waved her arms, shouting something Daniel couldn't hear. She retreated into her house, only to re-emerge minutes later with her own phone raised, filming the drone as if it were a threat. To her, the tables had turned. The woman who had built her reputation on surveilling others now found herself under surveillance, and she hated it. The footage spread quickly. Daniel shared short clips with a private neighborhood group, showing Karen's late-night trespassing and her obsessive behavior. Within hours, the comments flooded in. Some neighbors defended Karen, saying she was just trying to protect the neighborhood standards. But most were tired of her antics. They saw the drone footage for what it was, undeniable proof of harassment, and that's when the HOA board could no longer ignore the situation. The emails Karen had been sending suddenly collided with the evidence Daniel provided. For weeks, she had been painting herself as the victim, demanding the board fine Daniel for his unsightly chair. But now, the board had video proof that she was the aggressor, caught trespassing and escalating the conflict. Yet instead of resolving the issue, the HOA board hesitated. They didn't want to take sides. They didn't want to admit that one of their most vocal residents had crossed the line. And in their silence, the situation only grew worse. because Karen wasn't done, the drone became her obsession. She started claiming it was stalking her, invading her privacy, even though Daniel never flew it over her property. She called the police again, this time reporting the drone as a harassment device. Officers came out once more, but after reviewing the footage, they dismissed her claims. The drone was operating legally, and Daniel had every right to film from his property. The rejection fueled her anger. If the police wouldn't help her, if the HOA wouldn't side with her, then she would escalate on her own. She printed flyers accusing Daniel of being a neighborhood spy and slipped them into mailboxes. She confronted him in his driveway, shouting accusations while he calmly recorded with his phone. Each outburst only made her look more unstable, and each recording made her case weaker, but while Karen unraveled, Daniel grew more strategic. He didn't shout. He didn't retaliate with insults. He simply documented. Every flight of the drone, every nighttime trespass, every angry confrontation, it all went into a growing library of evidence, and soon, that evidence would ignite the neighborhood in ways no one could have imagined. Because one evening, the drone captured something unexpected. It was late, past midnight, when Daniel sent the drone up for a quiet hover. He wasn't expecting much, just routine surveillance after hearing noises near his driveway. But as the drone drifted across the street, its camera caught Karen sneaking into a neighbor's yard. She wasn't targeting Daniel this time. She was pulling up garden stakes, throwing small decorations into the trash, rearranging objects she deemed unsightly. The footage was shocking. It revealed what many had suspected but never proved. Karen's behavior wasn't limited to Daniel. She had been quietly policing the entire neighborhood, acting on her own twisted vision of order. When Daniel shared the clip with the neighborhood group, it spread like wildfire. Neighbors who had once tolerated Karen's behavior finally had proof that she was meddling far beyond her own property. Outrage grew. Demands for the HOA to act became louder, impossible to ignore, and in that moment, the battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Karen, furious, defensive, and unwilling to admit fault. On the other side stood Daniel and a growing coalition of neighbors, armed with evidence and determined to put an end to her reign of harassment. The chair had started it. The drone had exposed it. And now, the neighborhood itself was about to erupt into open conflict. As Chapter 2 closes, the quiet suburb was no longer just a peaceful place to live. It had become a battlefield of surveillance, accusations, and fractured alliances. And the HOA board, once comfortably neutral, was about to be dragged into the center of the storm. The drone footage had changed everything. What once seemed like isolated drama between two neighbors was now revealed as something much larger, a pattern of behavior that had touched nearly every home on the block. The images of Karen sneaking into yards at night, rearranging decorations, throwing away small garden ornaments, and pulling up carefully placed plants spread quickly through the private neighborhood group. Neighbors who had once dismissed Daniel's complaints suddenly realized they had been victims too. The missing flower pots, the mysteriously broken solar lights, the misplaced trash cans, all of it connected. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was Karen, and once the truth came out, anger followed. The HOA board, long silent in the face of Karen's constant demands, now found themselves drowning in a wave of complaints. Their inbox filled with furious emails from residents demanding action. Emergency meetings were called. What had once been a quiet suburban community now felt like a courtroom, with neighbors divided into camps, each side growing more hostile by the day. At the first emergency HOA meeting, attendance doubled. Neighbors who hadn't bothered with association politics in years suddenly filled the small community hall. Some came with printouts of Daniel's drone footage, others with stories of their own encounters with Karen. One by one, they stood up and shared how she had harassed, monitored, or even trespassed against them. Karen, of course, was there too. She arrived early, armed with folders of papers, photos she had taken of violations, and a rehearsed speech about how she was the only one truly protecting the neighborhood standards. She argued that Daniel's drone was an invasion of privacy, that his chair was an eyesore, and that everyone else was simply too lazy to follow the rules. But each time she spoke, Daniel's footage undercut her words. The screen at the front of the hall replayed her creeping through yards, tearing up plants, and stealing decorations. Gasps filled the room. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Whatever credibility she thought she had vanished before her eyes. Still, Karen refused to back down. The more cornered she became, the louder her protests grew. She accused Daniel of editing the footage, accused the board of conspiring against her, and even accused other neighbors of staging their own yards to make her look guilty. But her words rang hollow. By the end of the meeting, the board could no longer hide behind neutrality. They promised an investigation. They promised consequences. And for the first time, Karen realized the HOA wasn't her weapon, it was turning into her judge. But if the neighborhood thought that meant peace was around the corner, they were wrong, because Karen wasn't ready to lose. In the days after the meeting, her behavior escalated. She doubled down on her flyers, plastering the neighborhood with accusations against Daniel. She printed posters labeling him a drone stalker and taped them to light poles. She shouted at passers-by who stopped to talk on the sidewalk, warning them that they were siding with a criminal. Her house became a fortress. Curtains closed, cameras installed, floodlights triggered at the slightest movement. Every evening, she stood watch at her window, glaring at Daniel's driveway, waiting for the drone to rise, and rise it did. Daniel didn't stop. If anything, he flew the drone more frequently, capturing every moment of her erratic behavior. It wasn't about provocation, it was about protection. The more Karen spiraled, the more dangerous her behavior became. And the drone was his shield, documenting everything in case the conflict crossed a line that couldn't be undone. The breaking point came one weekend. It was a Saturday evening, when families usually gathered outside for barbecues, children played in the cul-de-sac, and the air filled with the sound of laughter. But that night, Karen stormed out of her house carrying a bucket of paint. Marching across the street, she poured it across Daniel's driveway, splattering the concrete with streaks of white. Gasps erupted from neighbors who witnessed it. Phones came out, cameras rolled, but none captured the event as clearly as Daniel's drone, hovering quietly above. It recorded every second, her furious expression, her aggressive motions, the unmistakable vandalism. By the time Daniel stepped outside, neighbors were already confronting her. Voices rose, arguments broke out, and children were rushed inside. The once peaceful street had descended into chaos, and through it all, Karen screamed about the chair. The same lawn chair that still sat quietly at the edge of Daniel's driveway, as ordinary and harmless as ever. In her mind, that chair had become a symbol of rebellion, a personal insult, and she was determined to erase it no matter the cost. The police were called again, but this time things were different. They didn't find a man sitting quietly in his chair. They found a driveway covered in paint, neighbors demanding justice, and crystal-clear drone footage of the culprit in action. Karen was cited for vandalism. She was warned about trespassing. And the HOA, now fully pressured by the community, began formal proceedings against her. Fines, suspension of privileges, and even potential removal from the association's good standing loomed over her. Yet even then, Karen wouldn't admit defeat. She stormed back into her house, slammed the door, and turned off her lights, but the neighborhood had seen enough. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. What started as a feud over a lawn chair had become a war of proof, a clash between obsession and resilience. And with the board preparing its final decision, and Karen more isolated than ever, the neighborhood braced for the conclusion of a drama that had consumed their lives for months. The weeks that followed were a tense waiting game. The HOA board held multiple closed-door meetings, neighbors speculated about the outcome, and Daniel quietly continued his flights. The drone had become more than just protection, it had become a symbol of resistance. Each time it rose into the air, it reminded Karen, and everyone else, that no amount of lies could erase the truth. Karen's house grew quieter. Her once relentless patrols stopped. Her flyers disappeared. Some thought she had finally surrendered, worn down by the weight of evidence and public opinion. But Daniel knew better. He could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break, and he was right. One night, just after midnight, the drone captured its final piece of footage. Karen, dressed in dark clothes, slipped out of her house carrying a hammer. She crept toward Daniel's driveway, eyes fixed on the lawn chair as though destroying it would erase everything that had happened. But what she didn't know was that the drone was already in the air, its camera following her every step. From above, it recorded her raising the hammer, bringing it down on the chair, smashing it into pieces. The sound of metal on concrete echoed in the night, waking neighbors who peered from their windows. And within moments, Daniel was outside, phone in hand, capturing the aftermath from the ground as the drone documented from above. It was the final straw. The next morning, Daniel released the footage. Within hours, it spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends shared it, local community groups reposted it, and soon the story of the neighbor who called the cops over a lawn chair and ended up destroying it herself began making waves online. The HOA board, already under pressure, moved swiftly. Karen was fined heavily, ordered to pay restitution for the damage, and stripped of her privileges within the association. Her reputation, once shielded by her loud voice and constant complaints, was shattered beyond repair. Neighbors who had once feared her now openly avoided her. Children whispered her name like a ghost story. And in the quiet that followed, Karen found herself alone. The very community she claimed to protect now united against her. As for Daniel, he replaced the lawn chair with a new one. Not flashy, not expensive, just another simple folding chair placed quietly at the edge of his driveway. And this time, no one dared to touch it. The drone returned to its shelf, its mission complete. But its memory lived on, in the footage, in the neighborhood's collective story, and in the lesson that sometimes the smallest objects can reveal the largest truths. The feud had ended,